the night before, I was having an argument, a discussion with this woman who sat next to me in this math class. And she had said to me, where are you going to graduate school in math? And I said, well, I'm not going to graduate school in math. I'm going to go to medical school. And she goes, you're going to go to medical school? She said, you're going to throw away your gift at math and become a doctor? And I said, I
wasting
said,
your life. You're wasting your life.
Sorry, well, I was very gifted at math, and
sure.
and she was just blown away.
For the listener, you were doing at 7, you were doing high school algebra.
Mm-hmm, yeah, and so she was just shocked I wasn't going to become a mathematician. I was just taking this math class for fun, but anyway, but when she said to me, you're throwing away God's gift, I was like shocked that she could. I said, you believe in God? I said, how can you believe in God and have gotten this far in math? And she said, how can you have gotten this far in math and not believe in God?
Welcome to another installment of Behind Greatness by Inspire. It's Luciano here speaking as your host. Before we get into it, I want to remind the listener, as per usual, please take some time, rate us if you can, and please do share with your family and friends. This is how we're growing. And if you are inclined to help us out with the cause, we are a registered charity, as most of our regular listeners know. Please visit us at our website to see the details, behindgreatness.org. You can see all the details there. And all the wonderful guests that we've had. It's now 2 years that we've been running and launching a new episode with very interesting people all around the world every week, every Wednesday morning, Eastern Standard. Today is going to be no different. So today we are joined by Diane Marie Hennacy. Diane is an MD and is a John Hopkins trained neuroscientist and neuropsychiatrist, former Harvard faculty member, and an award-winning author and clinician. She began studying autism in 1987 when she spent 6 months with Sir Michael Rudder. Is that Rudder? Is that correct? Rudder. There you go. You'd ask. With Sir Michael Rudder at the Institute for Psychiatry in London. She served as a member of a think tank on the evolution of human consciousness at the Salk Institute called La Jolla Group for Understanding the Origin of Humans, as the Director of Research for John E. Mack Institute, and on the Scientific Advisory Board of the Forever Family Foundation. She currently serves on the board of the Parapsychological Association and their PA Book Award Committee. Her experimental research focuses on investigating reports of telepathy and other savant skills in autistic children. It has been presented at international science conferences in the US and abroad, and is currently being filmed for a documentary. She is a polymath whose theoretical work bridges multiple scientific disciplines in its analysis of case studies in neuropsychiatry that challenge materialism's neurocentric model. Her 2008 book, which I had the pleasure of listening to, called The ESP Enigma, A Scientific Case for Psychic Phenomena, presents a rational argument for a new paradigm and has been translated into German, Portuguese, and Finnish. More recent theoretical contributions can be found in her chapters in the Oxford University Handbook of Psychology and Spirituality, and the first volume published by the Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Sciences, Is Consciousness Primary? You can, and we'll put it in the show notes as well. You can check her out on our website, drdianehennacy.com. And Diane, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Is it? Is it a pleasure? We will see after an hour of a chat. You are, so let's, right up front, you are working on a documentary.
Yes.
What will that be about?
Well, the primary focus of it is this population of autistic children that I've been studying for, over a decade. And these are children that have remarkable gifts, but one of the things that they all share in common is that they can reportedly read their mother's mind. And in one case, it's a foster father's mind. And It's one of those things where I've done controlled studies in it, and I've presented that work at scientific conferences, and it really needs to get explored further. And so what I'm doing is I'm actually doing simultaneous recordings using QEEG, which basically can create a brain map so that you know which areas of the brain are active, what frequencies are coming out of those regions of the brain, and doing simultaneous recordings of both the child and the parent to see if there are any changes that occur when they're engaged in this so-called telepathic communication as opposed to regular communication. And so far, the preliminary data goes right along with what I had predicted back when I wrote my book. I had some ideas about what would be different about brain activity in somebody who would be highly psychic.
The reason why we were put on to you is we were listening. I mentioned to you as well in our very first chat. We're listening to you on another podcast, another interview. And there's something there that you said that kind of clicked. I said, "Oh, wow, that's interesting. I want to know more." And I'm so glad we did reach out to you. And you said in that interview, speaking about telepathy, you said the most telepathic are the ones that have had language disrupted at an early age. So that also got me thinking. And here's the question to you. So you have to excuse me of my naivete throughout this whole discussion. So why don't we just put that, let's put that up on the board, okay? Is language a barrier to real understanding?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, there are so many difficulties with language. But first of all, language is extremely linear. So it really limits our ability to think. And so as somebody who's studied math, in which you start thinking, you start organizing information in ways that language doesn't allow you to, because in language, one word comes after the other. And so it's sort of dragging you along, just like the illusion of the time of, the time arrow, just dragging us along. And what modern physics tells us is that, that's an illusion about time, for example. And so language itself, being linear, it's also a left hemisphere skill. And one of the things that has been reported by others, this is, there's information on this going, way back, where where the right hemisphere is associated more with intuition. And it's associated, it's the hemisphere that's more active when we're in dreaming sleep. And dreaming sleep is, if it's a state that people experience commonly that is highly associated with psychic phenomena. And so the right hemisphere, though, is it's the nonverbal hemisphere. And the left hemisphere is where language is. And I'm talking about your average right-handed person, because we actually have exceptions to that, where the brains of people that are left-handed can be either the same as the brain of a right-handed person, or it can be the reverse. I mean, and so it's much more complicated than this. But in general, this is true about the left versus right hemisphere. And language is, we've known for a long time that that's a left hemisphere skill. And one of the things that fascinated me about autistic individuals is that they have left hemisphere handicaps. And one of those handicaps is in the area of language.
We had on the podcast as well Jill Bolt-Taylor. I'm not sure if you know her story.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So neuroanatomist, and she had a stroke, and her story is about the separation of her brain. I'm using common language here because it's the only language I can use to describe it. But she experienced both sides of her brain simultaneously, one being trapped in trying to communicate through numbers and language, and the other one floating, what did she say, in the sea of silent euphoria, like a whale. And that got me thinking. The reason why I bring her up is because listening through your book, I took a lot of bookmarks, as I told you before we started recording. There was some talk about left and right brain, a lot talk about left and right brain, and there are a couple of things that you mentioned. stuff that material that most listeners here, I think, would have heard to begin with, but bear with me. That the left side is the strategic side of your brain, where the right side considers possibilities. And then there was something that you said that I thought was pretty curious, and I think it was in that same chapter. Again, I regret not purchasing the physical copy of the book because I could see where the words are planted. You said people who think abstractly see what they expect to see rather than see what there is. Jill mentioned that she wasn't dumb, she wasn't stupid in that period in her life where she was trapped in the right side hemisphere. That she was there, that she was exploring, but she couldn't communicate it. It's my feeling that she was in a realm of her brain that she had never experienced before. And I'm going to say, using reference to your book, the psychic, she was channeling the psychic part of our brain. There was some sort of artistic or telepathic endeavor that she didn't understand. I say she, like we wouldn't understand, trapped in that side of the brain. I don't know if I'm being clear at all in what I'm saying, but let me go back to the word abstract. People who think abstractly, they see what they expect to see rather than what there is. What does that mean?
Well, what I mean by thinking abstractly is that they're manipulating symbols rather than the thing itself. And if you're manipulating a symbol, which is a representation of something, then you're deviating from reality. You know, that's to manipulate a symbol is different from actually manipulating, say, a physical object. So I can, for example, to put it into something more concrete, if I'm working in a chemistry lab and I'm doing the experiment of putting certain chemicals together, and then I'm able to actually create a new molecule that has certain properties, and I can test it and see, oh, I made that new molecule. Okay. Any manipulations I'm doing in that lab is something that I weigh heavily because that's a direct experiential data, as opposed to something where I'm taking a pencil and paper and I'm moving, atoms on a molecule and creating something that is a representation of the chemistry that I'm working with, but not necessarily, how it plays out in reality. And so it's this pairing between the two. And so when we get into more and more, the areas in which we don't really know of physical objects that we can manipulate, then we're getting more and more abstract, and we can get more and more into seeing reality a certain way. And there have been many studies that have been done showing that people see what they would expect to see. And a good example of that is some of the work that's been done on like optical illusions. Yeah, where we get fooled into seeing something a certain way, and it really looks that way to us. So, for example, there was this dress that went viral on the internet because some people who saw it said that it was lavender and black, and other people who saw it said it was white and gold. And you really, when you looked at it, you saw it as one or the other of those. And the difference was whether or not you interpreted it as being in the shade or interpreted it as being in the sun. Because so what happens is that our sensory system picks up information, and what our brain does is it creates the display of that information. And that display that we experience can be a totally different display than somebody else who is in the same room as us that we think is picking up this, perceiving the same reality as us. And so the degree to which the mind can do that is remarkable. It's just we generally, most of us, we try to form a consensual reality.
You said the last time we spoke that we're not equal to our brains. We are merely the users of the brain.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
When we were talking about consciousness, actually, you were talking, I was just listening, but you were talking about consciousness as the cloud.
Yes, I think that's a good analogy for thinking about the brain's relationship to consciousness, as opposed to thinking that the brain creates consciousness.
Why study parapsychology? And for the listener who doesn't understand, what is parapsychology? Why, and then why did you enter it?
Yeah. So parapsychology, which is actually most parapsychologists hate the name and wish we could change it, but the Parapsychological Association, of which I'm a board member, is actually a member of the Scientific Academy. Margaret Mead played a role in helping that become the case, and so, in other words, it actually is considered as a legitimate area of scientific inquiry, but what has not been accepted by mainstream science is that any of the evidence is sufficient, and that's where we have this big difference. So parapsychology, what it is psychology is like the human, human psyche, human mind, and para means beside, and so it's basically all of that stuff that we think of as being outside of what we consider normal human experience. And then the question is, who sets those boundaries of what's outside and what's inside? But anyway, parapsychology means, by definition, it's outside of that.
One of the last things you told me, actually, in our last conversation, is that you said you're an artist. But we did most of our conversation was around your work and around the scientific discovery and exploration of your life. Why did you tell me you were an artist?
I most identify with being an artist in in terms of well, let me put it this way. I was art is a right brain skill. And I originally I started out in architecture because I was an artist who wanted to actually create the kind of art that people could experience. So it's kind of a practical artist. And yet at the same time, I'd been groomed since a young age as a scientist. And so it's sort of like it's like I have two parts of myself, and most people are only aware of the scientist, but I'm just as much an artist.
Well, yeah, you said you got bored very quickly when you were studying architecture, and you were you were taking courses on the side, psychology. What did you say? Psychology, neuroscientist. You worked in a lab. You were fascinated by ducks. Is that right? Did I heard that right?
Yes.
I'm going to stop myself here and interrupt myself. Why ducks? What is it about ducks?
Oh, well, see, I have the kind of, there's just something about my personality that I always, I'm the kind of person, if I was going to do a jigsaw puzzle, I'd go for the 1,000-piece puzzle first. I mean, I like a challenge, and ducks. So I was taking an ethology class, which is the study of animal behavior, and we had to study an animal during the springtime. So we were studying all of their mating rituals. We had to study then their early parenting behaviors, and we had to study them around the clock, and we had to keep a log of all of their behaviors. And so I did this with photographs and everything. And I chose ducks because they could walk, and they can fly, and they can swim. So they have behaviors in the sky and on earth. There's so much complication there. And ducks always seem sort of chaotic to me, because during the mating, I mean, ducks are not monogamous. I mean, during the mating season, you'll have one female duck, with, several male ducks, trying to mount her at the same time. And it's like, that looks kind of chaotic, because, my birds and bees was more, a little bit more one-on-one. And so I was just like, so because I lived near rivers as a kid, and so I saw ducks, and I just like, so animal behavior just seemed chaotic to me. And when I wanted the challenge of, could I make sense out of the chaos of ducks? And oh my gosh, it was a real revelation for me when I discovered that I could. When I realized that I could predict what ducks were going to do, because it was like recognizing that, for example, on mating rituals or dances. And I'm a dancer. I've been dancing since I was 4 years old. And so it's like all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I know what that duck's going to do. And then that duck's going to do this. And then all of a sudden it shifted this view that we have of more randomness to something that was, far more fascinating. And so I wanted to understand how that worked.
This reminds me of a discussion I just listened to yesterday, the day before, a snippet of a discussion of a poet, David White. Mm-hmm. And he started off as a scientist. He's a famous poet out of the UK, living in the US, I think now. But he started off as a biologist and then a zoologist. And he said he realized when he was in the Galapagos, he was doing whatever studying fieldwork he was doing. He said, the problem with the science that I was learning is that it was taking me away from the eye. It was from what I was seeing, so what I interpreted is what he was seeing was, I guess, feeling, you can even say feeling, I suspect. Because I'm hearing from you as a dancer, you were feeling their movements, you were feeling where they wanted to go, you were sensing that. Is that experience was taken out of the study because it wasn't evidential, like it wasn't something that could be measured. And he said he was missing that sort of dimension. Anyway, so maybe that's a digression. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know. Take it as a digression.
Well, it's one of those things where, with science, we're supposed to take the subjective component out, and it's all supposed to be objective. And then what's happened is when we're trying to study living systems, and yet we're mainly studying them as dead formerly living systems. Right. And how are you supposed to understand life that way? And I think that there is a role for the subjective component, but you need to understand that you're being subjective. So it's okay to have that as long as you qualify it as such.
Maybe it means that there is also subjectivity in objectivity. I don't know. It could be off.
I think it's hard. I think it's hard for people to be totally objective.
You said, so let's stay on that same line. So you shortly after med school, or maybe as you were coming into your own as a scientist, you said you saw scientists. You saw that scientists were invested in the materialist model, and you left mainstream academia. And I like this analogy. So we were talking about analogies. Like a mountain climber going to the top and seeing other mountains that are higher, you wanted an aerial view to see how expansive things really are. So for the listener, how do you define a savant?
Well, so savant comes from the Latin, from savoir, which means to know. And what savants have is they have knowledge that we don't understand how they have it. It's not acquired in the usual way. So an example would be children who've never studied math, who don't have who aren't thought to have the capacity to even do math, who can give you multiple digit prime numbers just all day long, just tell you what consecutive prime numbers, at which we don't even really have a very good algorithm for that, and they're not deriving them; they just somehow know them, or they can do calendar calculation where they can, you tell them your birthday and they'll tell you what day of the week it was, and so how do they know that? Or sometimes you have children that reportedly picked up language that they weren't taught. So to me, that sounds so much like psychic abilities, things like clairvoyance, for example, which is when you can see things from a distance, so remote viewing. It's just so similar. It's like, well, why are we accepting savant syndrome? Because, and and saying all of this other stuff like telepathy and precognition and clairvoyance can't be real, but we'll accept savant syndrome. Well, they accepted savant syndrome because it's highly reliable when you try to repeat it. And it's been repeated to people's satisfaction that they go, yeah, this is a real thing. We don't understand it. And it's been so rare. I mean, prodigious savants, there's probably only maybe 100 in the entire world. So it's so rare that most people never run into it. And so you can just ignore it. But now in this internet age, even things that are fairly rare, a lot of us have become aware of it.
And the question is, why ignore it? Because it exists. Also, in our last chat, you mentioned, staying on this theme, that when kids are first born, and this is also a very strong theme in your book. And again, I'm going to repeat my regret for not buying the paper copy. When kids are first born, they find themselves in the informational field. Then they start to touch and taste everything, and they get used to the sensory experience, and in a way get locked into it, get trapped into it, and then don't remember their experience in the informational field. Whereas savants are closer, or maybe living in that informational field. So let me ask you then a question, because I was listening to Carl Ruck, who's on this show, back in episode 73. We had a fascinating conversation. He's a social scientist. Actually, he wanted to get into psychiatry, and then he moved to the classics. He's an untrained carpenter. So we talked about the skill that he has as a carpenter. He doesn't know where he got it. He just likes working with wood, and he does it. Didn't go to any classes, wasn't trained. And most of us have something like this. Most of us are good at something without having been trained in it prior. It's like we're remembering something. Can we say that those tendencies to a certain skill or a talent or a desire come from an informational field that we have forgotten about? That question makes sense?
That question makes sense. I mean, so let me just back up a little bit and just say that I should add to the savant definition that it's those exceptional abilities in the setting of someone who otherwise has disabilities. So somebody who can give you prime numbers, but they can't do math, or there are people that are savants that can speak multiple languages, but they can barely dress themselves. So it's this extremism. And so a lot of us, we don't have that kind of extremism, so we wouldn't be called savants, but we somehow have these abilities to excel at certain things, and we don't really understand where that comes from. I mean, a lot of it's been attributed to genetic memory, and it's. I've studied genetics and worked and did molecular biology during the Human Genome Project, because after realizing that neuroscience was really nowhere close to trying to figure things out, I thought, well, maybe there's some answers in the genes, and so I wanted to learn about it. And then it turned out that we only have around 20,000 genes, and so now we're looking at, well, what controls the genes? But you get into epigenetics, and you can have, that's a model through which you could have behaviors transmitted, and you can have things skip generations. And so that's true. You can explain a fair number of things that way, but then you're going to always find exceptions where it's like, where does this person know it? And some people evoke the whole concept of previous lives, that there's this idea that when we that we basically, we come in and out, adopting different bodies and different lives, and that in the very beginning we can remember it, but then we forget it. And it's hard there's a lot of evidence for reincarnation, but it's a hard thing to get people to buy into. And ironically, I mean, one of the reasons why people won't buy into it, even though, I mean, there was research done by a psychiatrist at the University of Virginia Ian Stevenson, there's still research being done there. And these are psychiatrists like myself. And they would have this small child from a village who would give them details about the names and even tell them where to go. And they'd go there and they'd see that everything was exactly as the child described it. And so the counter argument to reincarnation is that the kid must be highly psychic. Okay, well, but you can't say then reincarnation is not true because it could be psychic, and then say but psychic abilities aren't possible because the brain creates consciousness. And I mean, it's like they just kind of back away from where the evidence is leading those of us who have inquiring minds to think.
It sounds like it's simply it's the stubborn reinvestment in a materialist frame of thought. It's like not looking. Who was it that came out? Avi Loeb. It's like not looking through the telescope because you already know what's there, so you don't want to bother looking through it. Like it doesn't make sense. So speaking of reincarnation, so we actually had a social scientist here, Antonia Mills, who actually was hired by Ian Stevenson in Canada to do some studies on children for reincarnation research. And we actually want to get Jim Tucker, who's at the University of Virginia, who's yeah, you know him, of course. You said, so we were chatting about reincarnation and your thoughts, and you gave me another high level thought. You said, we as conscious beings create our bodies and we shed them after we're done. Elaborate. Go for it.
Well, I took this when I was working on that chapter for the book is consciousness primary. You conduct a thought experiment with, well, what does that mean? And then what are all the implications of that? And I thought, well, if consciousness is primary, I mean, that implies instead of the brain making consciousness, what if consciousness creates the brain? And that's very interesting to think of, that we sort of exist as a consciousness field, let's say, and that we organize matter within our field. Okay. So, and that's easier to conceptualize because think about what we already experience. We already experience the ability to organize matter because that's what we want to do. I can rearrange my house. I'm organizing things around me all the time. So to think that you've got a consciousness field that's able to arrange the various atoms, molecules, whatever, together to create a body. Oh, that makes sense. I mean, we actually kind of experience it that way. If you the child, when they're is developing. I mean, they're developing, and so rapidly. How is that happening? We there's a lot of explanations that we don't understand for development. I mean, each one of those cells has something like 100,000 chemical reactions per second going on. And everything's orchestrated by what? And if the genes are orchestrating it, how are the genes orchestrating it? Through what? It's got to be a field. That's what organizes matter. It's a magnetic field that organizes the iron filings. So obviously there's a field effect happening that's organizing things. And I thought, well, that makes a lot of sense that we have a consciousness field that creates the body, and then after the body has a shelf life, so to speak. It can only last so long. The consciousness field just no longer is engaged with it.
My very early childhood scientific training would have assumed that you were about to say dissipates when you said consciousness field dissipates, but you said it no longer engages. I think that's what you said. Engages.
That's right. It no longer engages.
Yeah, that's not a word. It's not a terminology that we're trained to use when we talk about conscious field or field, for that matter.
No, it's not. But it's kind of interesting to think about. Just to think about all of the implications of that. But it's kind of like it's almost the sort of analogy I think of is that it's almost like the puppet master just dropping the puppet.
We talked about removing obstacles. So speaking of which, it's a great segue. Thank you. As a psychiatrist, it's really about the removal of resistance to change. And then you educated me on the householder path versus spiritual path.
Well, actually, the householder path is it is considered a legitimate spiritual path. It's just that what happens is the person who's taking the householder path is choosing to engage in life in the way that they get a job, they have children, they do all those things that we think of as maintaining a household. For so many of us as human beings, that is a huge emphasis in our life. But then after they've achieved that, the children are grown, then they devote the rest of their life to spiritual matters. Whereas there are people who, from the get-go, from a very early age, they identify the spiritual path as the one they want to take, and so they find a guru. They go to they go into solitude. They meditate, but whatever it is, they forgo having the householder's life. They forgo having children. They just and their whole life is devoted to spirituality. And it's interesting to compare and contrast the two paths, because sometimes people, when they're on the householder path, they can think of themselves as, gee, I'm not on a spiritual path. And yet the reality is that I see that as still a spiritual path. It's actually a more challenging one, because it's by entering into those aspects of life that we get tested. We can think we're the most amazing person on the planet, until somebody ges us upset and we see ourselves do something that we really wouldn't want to own, as our own behavior. And so the reality is that they're both legitimate. They're just different.
Which path are you on?
Well, I obviously took the householder path, and that I got married. I had a daughter. I live in a house, but now that my daughter's grown, the spiritual side of things is really incredibly important to me. And I feel that this research that I'm doing with these autistic children is actually spiritual work, because so many of them are here with a spiritual message too. I mean, which I find fascinating. They're not just exhibiting some of these abilities that we wonder, how's that possible? But that they actually talk about, why aren't we, why do people have to fight? Why can't we all get along? Why are we destroying the planet? Why are we, so they're drawing attention to themselves, I think, maybe perhaps for some higher purpose.
So we tend to do that with kids because we argue successfully to ourselves. We argue that children just don't understand. They don't have the capacity to explain what they're thinking. But it's not about, it's in the needing for the explanation that we limit ourselves to what and how kids understand. Because you use that in a conversation. You used the word field in our last conversation. You used the word field in your book. Children are part of a field, or they're closer to the field that we were all part of. Their core is less tarnished than ours, and we dismiss it, and we dismiss it too quickly. And I say this. I only say this. You prompt me to say this because you said there is something spiritual about children and the message that they give us. You were a child. You almost died in a canoe mishap. I put a marker here not to forget. And you had never mentioned this to me. You just mentioned that in passing. Is that something you can share? You want to share?
Yeah, the first time I was about 4 years old, and my father liked to climb mountains, and so he would take us hiking into these, and he had no he just he didn't have those kind of, protective father abilities. He just didn't think that way. He was a brilliant man, and he was just so captivated by whatever it was he was pursuing. He wasn't thinking about things like, oh, your 4-year-old might fall off the side of the cliff. And so, and I was following my dad, and then the trail underneath my feet started to crumble away, and I mean, we were well over 100 feet up, and some instinct in me just grabbed just a little bit of it was like vegetation or something that was on the side of the cliff, and was just hanging on to it for dear life. And then my father was able to rescue me. But after that incident, I went home, and I realized, because my father was a scientist, and he taught me a lot about nature, and I had seen, I think, like my tadpoles die or something. I know that I'd already experienced death, so I knew death was a possibility. And then when my father, when I understood that I almost died there, then growing up with the materialist model, my dad, I just thought my life was meaningless and that it was almost taken away that easily. And I decided I really wanted to make my life meaningful. And I remember walking around in my room just thinking, I've got to make my life meaningful. I just can't. To me, it was a worse death. Yes, to me, it was a worse death to die without having done anything, so that you could be remembered for anything. That bothered me more than just death itself. I saw death, it's inevitable. So and so I thought about it, and I thought, suffering, because I understood suffering, and I said, eliminating suffering, that's got to be what I got to do. And so I've been involved in things to try to alleviate suffering ever since I can remember.
One of the first things you said to me, let's go a little bit politically incorrect, or maybe it isn't, I don't know. I really don't know anymore in our world. You said you're not afraid of dying, but you're afraid of going insane.
Oh, I'm not afraid of dying. I overcame that a long time ago. I mean, I almost drowned when I was around 13, and even had a life review. And so I'm not afraid of dying, but I never did drugs because I was afraid of losing my mind, and I saw that happen to other kids, and where somebody just never came back from a bad trip, and so I've never had an experience that's made me ever question my sanity, but I was exposed to people who had lost theirs, and so a lot of people I know that are into consciousness studies are people who've used psychedelics to expand their consciousness. But that's, for me, I could never have taken that path. I needed to do it by interacting with people, I guess, who saw reality differently than how I did. And when I interacted with them, and like the woman I met at Harvard, who actually all of a sudden started telling me all these things about myself. She is a patient, and she's doing a psychic reading on me that was highly accurate. I'm just like, what? So that's the way that I ended up on this path, and not because I myself ever had anything that made me question my sanity.
Thank you for sharing that, and also for sharing that little tidbit about a life review. So you had a near-death experience, is that correct?
Yeah. I've had.
I'm all ears.
I've had. Well, it was just I was in a boat with my. Yeah, I was.
Sorry,
in a
let me interrupt that, because you said you've had, and it felt like you wanted to tell me you've had more than one. Am I wrong?
Yes. I've had more than one.
What? This comes out now? Okay, go. You're 13. killing me. You're killing me. Go. Let's do the first one at least, the 13.
Well, the first one was that I was in a river with my brother and a friend of his in a boat, and they didn't. I tried to tell them I couldn't swim, and I hadn't learned how to swim, and they tipped the boat over, and I went down. I couldn't fight against the current of the river, and I went down. And I remember going down and just feeling peaceful that I was going to die, which was the strangest thing to think about rationally. But somehow I became peaceful, and I had this thought, well, my mother's she's going to be upset when she sees I don't show up for dinner. And so I had that thought, but there wasn't like this strong emotion in it. It was just kind of a resignation. And I remember seeing, and it happened in a flash because I was only 13, but I remember, just different things in my life just go. And I'd never heard of a life review. None of this was something that I had ever heard about. And so I never really thought that much about it until when I started getting into studying some of the, looking into near-death experiences. I was like, oh my gosh, we talk about a life review. And I thought, oh, well, I had that. And then when I was applying to medical school, I was crossing the street on a rainy day, and somebody who was they were on a bicycle, hit me and knocked me down out cold in the middle of the street. And I didn't come to for several hours. I came to on a neurosurgery floor. And that experience changed my life forever, because so let me back up. The night before, I was having an argument, a discussion with this woman who sat next to me in this math class. And she had said to me, where are you going to graduate school in math? And I said, well, I'm not going to graduate school in math. I'm going to go to medical school. And she goes, you're going to go to medical school? She said, you're going to throw away your gift at math and become a doctor? And I said, I
wasting
said,
your life. You're wasting your life.
Sorry, I was very gifted at math, and
sure.
and she was just blown away.
For the listener, you were doing at 7. You were doing high school algebra.
Mm-hmm, yeah, and so she was just shocked I wasn't going to become a mathematician. I was just taking this math class for fun, but anyway, but when she said to me, you're throwing away God's gift, I was like shocked that she could. I said, you believe in God? I said, how can you believe in God and have gotten this far in math? And she said, how can you have gotten this far in math and not believe in God? And it was the next day that I was hit. And when I came to on the neurosurgery floor, I felt different. I didn't know what it was that was different, but there was something different about me. And all of a sudden I had this like eureka moment. And I was just like, oh my God, this is maybe what it feels like to know God exists. And I was like, but how can I know God exists? Because I had no memory for that period of time I was unconscious. And yet it was like, now I know this. I was like, I don't know. I had just had this argument with this woman the night before. I said, there's no way you can be raised an atheist and then become a believer in God. You've got, it's like there's a, it's a gap that can't be crossed. It's like that bridge, that boat has done sailed. I mean, we're not. It's not going to happen. Someone could proselytize me till my dying day, and I'm not going to believe in God. And so then for the next day, for me to all have this feeling, and I was just like, I don't understand this. And everybody who knew me, I told them about it. And they're just like, oh, it'll go away. It'll go away.
It'll pass.
It'll pass. And it didn't pass. And
it hasn't ever.
And it hasn't. And so then that took me on, that's when my spiritual journey really began. And that's when years after it didn't pass. And I just had to study world religions in order to try and make sense of it.
Could it be, to use again your words, could it be in the span of those few hours before you woke up on the surgery gurney or on a surgery bed, that you maybe tapped into that informational field that you were tapped into before you were born, and you just didn't remember?
I think really that's what a lot of these near-death experiences are. I mean, some people call it like returning to the source, and which is kind of interesting. I mean, whatever that means. But yeah, I think so. When I attended a lecture by Phyllis Atwater and on near-death experiences. And when she was listing all of the sequelae, the changes in a person, not just psychologically, but the changes in a person physically after having had a near-death experience, I was like, oh my gosh, that describes me. I just thought I had all these quirky things about me, but that actually describes me. And so I talked with her afterwards. And when I told her about my experience, she said, "Oh yeah, that counts as a near-death experience. You don't have to have died and been resuscitated. You can have a near-death experience from a head injury for sure."
Last question, Dan. What is greatness to you?
What is greatness to me?
Mm-hmm.
What is greatness? I would say that I would use the word transcendence in the sense that if you transcend whatever the original conditions are, so it's then you reach greatness. So for example, if you were a puny little kid and then you become somebody who's like a superior athlete or whatever. I mean, you've achieved greatness in the physical body. So for me, my work has been about trying to advance scientific theory. And so when I think of greatness in that sense, I think of people who have really I think of people like Einstein, who came up with those theories, and here he was working as a patent clerk, and yet he came up with a theory of relativity. And I mean, here we are 100 years later, and we're still we haven't made any advances in science anywhere, in comparison to that. And so to me, it's that transcendence. Starting off with something where the expectations aren't really there.
Here's how I'll finish off the conversation, because you said your dad taught you two things, and we didn't talk enough about your mom and your dad, because your mom was a polyglot, your dad was a polymath, and your dad was an inventor, mathematician, marine biologist. He was 17 different scientists in one. But he said that he taught you two things. Two basic things, in my opinion, but so important, that you shouldn't believe everything you read, and taught you not to be afraid of what people think of you.
Mm-hmm.
That's obviously a life lived, taking those two pieces of advice to heart. Thank you for sharing all of this, Diane.
Thank you.
Hey, it's Enrico Colantoni here, actor, director, and dedicated napper. Like what you heard today, there's more to come. Make sure to subscribe to Behind Greatness and learn about our live events at inspirenorth.com. You'll also find links to our social media right on our website, so be sure to give us a like and follow. Until next time, stay inspired.